While the royal family stays quiet, leaked documents are exposing exactly how William makes his millions. For months, the palace said nothing. No statement, no press conference, no royal correspondent briefed in advance. Just silence, while a 5-month investigation quietly tore through more. Then 5,000 land registry documents connected to one of the most secretive financial empires in Britain. And what those documents reveal is not just a story about money. It is a story about power, about land seized by medieval kings centuries ago, and about how that same land is still working today, generating millions of pounds a year for a man who will one day sit on the throne. This is the story of the Duchy of Cornwall, and how a joint investigation by Channel 4's Dispatches and the Sunday Times pulled back the curtain on William's private fortune. Royal finances have always been wrapped in a kind of deliberate fog. Ask most people in Britain how the royal family actually makes its money, and you will get vague answers. Taxpayer funding, maybe some inherited wealth, perhaps a vault somewhere filled with jewels and gold. What almost nobody mentions, because almost nobody knows, is that 2 enormous semi-private business empires sit quietly behind the throne, generating tens of millions of pounds every single year through land deals most of the country has never heard of and would never be able to trace. These are the Duchy of Lancaster, which funds the monarch directly, and the Duchy of Cornwall, which funds whoever currently holds the title Prince of Wales. Together, they form a financial engine that has operated largely outside public scrutiny for centuries, hidden behind layers of historic precedent and carefully worded annual reports that show totals without ever showing the full story behind those totals. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Duchy actually is. It is not a charity. It is not a government department. It is a private estate valued at more than £1 billion that exists for one purpose: to fund the lifestyle and official duties of whoever happens to be the eldest son of the reigning monarch. When Charles became king in September 2022, the title of Duke of Cornwall passed automatically to William. With it came control of more than 130,000 acres of land scattered across England, farms, coastlines, historic buildings, mining rights, and commercial properties stretching through more than 20 counties. The Duchy of Cornwall itself dates back to 1337, when it was carved out by Edward III for his son, the Black Prince, who became its first holder. Since then, with only brief interruptions during periods when there was no male heir to inherit the title, the estate has passed automatically from monarch to eldest son for nearly 700 years. It survived the execution of a king. It survived the English Civil War. It survived the rise of Parliament and the slow erosion of royal power that turned Britain into a modern constitutional democracy. Through all of it, the land itself, the actual physical acres in Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Herefordshire, and the Isles of Scilly, simply stayed where it was, generating income for whichever prince happened to be standing in line for the throne at the time. For generations, the inner workings of this estate stayed almost completely hidden from public view. The Duchy released annual accounts every single year, sure, but those accounts told you the bottom line, not the story behind it. They told you William made £23.6 million last year. They did not tell you who was paying that money, or why, or what it actually felt like to be one of the thousands of ordinary people in public institutions writing checks to the future king. The accounts are audited. They are presented to Parliament as required by an act of law passed back in 1838. But presenting a summary to Parliament once a year is a very different thing from genuine public transparency, and that gap between technical compliance and real accountability is exactly what this investigation set out to close. That changed when journalists from Channel 4 and the Sunday Times decided to dig. Over 5 months, they compiled a dossier of land registry titles connected to both the Duchy of Cornwall and its sister estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, which funds the monarch directly. What they found was a documentary they called The King, the Prince, and Their Secret Millions, paired with newspaper reporting that laid out, in granular detail, exactly where this money was coming from. And the list of who was paying rent to the future king is where this story gets uncomfortable. Start with the lifeboats. The RNLI, the charity that exists purely to save lives at sea, operates 5 lifeboat stations across Cornwall and 1 more in Devon: Penley, Rock, Senning Cove, the Lizard, St. Mary's, Salcombe. Every single one of those stations sits on land owned by the Duchy, and every single one of those stations pays rent to use the slipway that lets their boats reach the water. The total charged across all 6 locations comes to £600 a year. It sounds small. It is small. But that is exactly the point investigators were making. This is not about whether £600 will bankrupt a charity. It is about the principle that a charity built entirely around saving drowning sailors has to pay anything at all to the private estate of a future king just to put a boat in the sea. Then there is Dartmoor Prison. This one is bigger and stranger. The Duchy of Cornwall owns the land beneath Dartmoor Prison in Princetown, Devon, and has a 25-year leasehold deal with the Ministry of Justice worth £37.5 million. That works out to £1.5 million a year, flowing from the British government, meaning from taxpayers, into William's estate. Here is the strange part. Earlier in the year, all 175 inmates at Dartmoor were moved out after dangerously high levels of radon gas were detected in the accommodation blocks. Radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas that seeps up from the ground in certain geological areas, and prolonged exposure to it is linked to lung cancer. The prison sat empty, unusable, a health hazard significant, enough to require a full evacuation of every single inmate to other facilities across the country. And the rent kept being paid anyway. £1.5 million a year for a building nobody could safely occupy, flowing uninterrupted into an estate that calls itself a champion of community well-being. Then there is the National Health Service. Investigators found that the Duchy of Lancaster, the King's estate rather than William's, struck a deal worth £11.4 million over 15 years to store an electric ambulance fleet for Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust in London. Money meant to keep emergency vehicles on the road for one of London's busiest hospital trusts, flowing instead through a warehouse lease into a royal estate that pays no corporation tax and no capital gains tax. Schools paid too. One elementary school in Princetown, the same small town that sits beside Dartmoor Prison, was found to be paying over £15,000 a year in rent to the Duchy of Cornwall, a primary school, paying the future king's estate just to keep its doors open on land that centuries ago was simply taken by the crown and never given back. And then there is the military. The Ministry of Defence, the same government department responsible for funding Britain's armed forces, was found to be paying the Duchy of Cornwall to rent land. Let that sit for a moment. William's father, King Charles, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the institution those armed forces belong to is paying rent to his son's private estate for the privilege of using land that, in any other context, most people would assume already belonged to the country itself. There is more. Camelford House, a property connected to the Duchy, has reportedly brought in at least £22 million since 2005 through a share of its rental income. St. John's Ambulance, the charity for which King Charles himself serves as patron, was found to have paid the Duchy of Cornwall almost £60,000 for the use of Duchy land. A charity, paying rent to an estate whose royal patron is the king's own father figure of the organization. The irony writes itself. Investigators also found that the Duchy of Cornwall holds 351 separate mineral rights titles across Cornwall and has signed agreements allowing drilling at historic mining sites, including the old tin mine at Wheal Vor near Helston. Local residents, some of whom have spent years dealing with water contamination left behind by mining that happened more than a century ago, formed a campaign group specifically to fight new drilling in the area. Their concern is straightforward. The water table in that region is already damaged. More drilling risks making it worse, and the deal that could make that happen was signed by an estate that markets itself as a champion of environmental restoration. That contradiction runs through the entire investigation, and it is maybe the sharpest edge of the whole story. William has spent years building a public image around environmental responsibility. His Earthshot Prize exists specifically to fund and celebrate solutions to climate change. He has spoken on global stages about the urgency of protecting the planet for future generations. And yet the documentary found that the Duchy of Cornwall has financial ties to one of the biggest industrial polluters in Europe through land leased for mining operations. Investigators also discovered that 14% of homes rented out by the Duchy of Cornwall and 13% of those rented by the Duchy of Lancaster have energy performance ratings of F or G, the two lowest possible grades. This matters because it has been against UK law since 2020 for landlords to rent out properties below an E rating. Some of the very homes funding William's income may not have met the minimum legal standard for energy efficiency. So how does the Duchy explain any of this? When journalists put these findings to them, a spokesperson for the Duchy of Cornwall responded by describing the estate as a private business with what they called a commercial imperative, paired alongside a commitment to environmental restoration and social impact in local communities. They pointed to William's pledge to make the estate carbon neutral by the end of 2032, and they highlighted mental health support programs set up for Duchy tenants, along with partnerships aimed at tackling homelessness in Cornwall. The Duchy of Lancaster, representing the King's estate, gave a similar response, describing itself as a commercial company that manages land and property assets while complying with all relevant legislation and regulatory standards. Both statements are technically accurate. Neither one actually addresses the deeper question raised by the investigation, which is not whether these deals are legal. They almost certainly are. The question is whether it is appropriate for two private estates, run by the two most powerful unelected figures in the country, to generate this kind of income from schools, hospitals, the military, and disaster charities, while paying no corporation tax and no capital gains tax, and while neither man is legally required to pay any income tax on what the duchies bring in at all. That last point is worth sitting with. Since the 1990s, both the King and the Prince of Wales have voluntarily paid income tax on the surplus generated by their respective duchies. Voluntarily. Not because the law requires it, but because doing otherwise would almost certainly be a public relations disaster. The practice began under Charles, back when he was still Prince of Wales, partly in response to growing public unease about a tax-exempt royal fortune existing alongside ordinary households who had no choice but to pay every penny they owed. William reportedly pays somewhere between £5 and £7 million a year in income tax from his duchy earnings. It sounds like a significant sum, and it is, but it is also a number that exists entirely because the royal family chooses to make it exist, not because Parliament has ever forced their hand. There is no law on the books requiring it. If a future Duke of Cornwall decided tomorrow to stop paying voluntarily, there would be nothing Parliament could do to compel them, short of rewriting centuries of constitutional precedent. The entire arrangement rests on goodwill and public relations calculation rather than legal obligation, which is precisely the kind of structural quirk investigative journalists tend to find irresistible. Critics were quick to seize on this distinction. Graham Smith, chief executive of the anti-monarchy campaign group Republic, did not hold back when speaking to reporters. He framed the entire situation in terms of basic standards, corruption and abuse of public money and public office. His argument is simple. If any politician structured their personal finances this way, collecting rent from public institutions through opaque historic land claims while avoiding standard corporate taxation, it would be treated as a national scandal. Because it involves the royal family, it gets treated instead as a quirky historical footnote, something explained away by tradition rather than scrutinized as modern financial behavior. Smith has spent years pushing for a full, independent audit of royal finances, arguing that the current system allows the family to present whatever figures it chooses in whatever framing it chooses, without any outside body ever verifying the complete picture. This investigation, in his view, is exactly the kind of work that should be happening as a matter of routine government oversight, rather than something that only surfaces when journalists spend 5 months piecing together fragments of public record by hand. That invisibility is not accidental. Land registry filings are technical, scattered across local authorities, and written in language designed for solicitors, rather than journalists or members of the public. Connecting a £600 lifeboat lease in Cornwall to a £37 million prison deal in Devon to an Elev Royal commentators offered a different perspective. Author Ingrid Seward, who has written extensively about the family, made the point that the royals are technically only custodians of these estates. They cannot sell the Duchy of Lancaster or the Duchy of Cornwall outright. They hold them in trust for their lifetime before passing them to whoever inherits the role next. Her broader argument is that most of the public already assumes the royal family has enormous wealth, so revelations like this barely shift public opinion. People expect the institution to be wealthy. The duchies, in her view, function less like personal slush funds and more like permanent endowments tied to whoever happens to occupy a specific constitutional role. She has suggested that genuine outrage requires genuine surprise, and very little about a wealthy royal family actually surprises the average person on the street anymore. The numbers might be new. The underlying assumption that the monarchy is, and always has been, extremely wealthy is not. Both arguments have some truth in them, but neither fully answers the central tension this investigation exposed. The Duchy of Cornwall is not simply an inheritance sitting untouched in a vault. It is an active, aggressive commercial operation. It owns the foreshore around large stretches of Cornwall and parts of South Devon, including the riverbed beneath the River Tamar. That ownership alone generates income through wayleave payments from telecommunications, companies running cables and equipment through the area. The Tamar Crossings Authority pays the Duchy a portion of that income every year. The Torpoint Ferry, a small chain ferry that locals depend on for crossing the river, pays an annual rent simply because its operating chains rest on a riverbed the Duchy claims to own. None of these individual payments are enormous on their own. A few £100s here, a few thousand there. But stacked together across thousands of land registry titles spanning more than 20 counties, the picture that emerges is of an estate engineered deliberately and carefully to extract small recurring payments from virtually everyone who interacts with land it controls: ferries, lifeboats, telecom cables, mining rights, prison leases, hospital storage deals, school rents. It adds up to tens of millions of pounds a year, collected from a network so vast that most of the people paying into it likely have no idea their money is ultimately funding the future king's personal income. This is the part of the story the palace has been most reluctant to engage with publicly. Not the individual numbers, which the Duchy has been willing to defend one at a time, framing them as standard commercial arrangements that any landowner might enter into. What goes largely unaddressed is the scale and the pattern. A primary school paying rent, a prison paying rent on a building it cannot even use, a military department, paying rent to the institution it ultimately serves under, a charity built around saving lives at sea, paying rent to put its boats in the water. Individually, each of these can be explained away as a normal commercial transaction involving a major landowner. Collectively, they raise a much harder question about whether an institution funded so heavily by an accident of birth should be allowed to operate with this level of opacity in the first place. It is also worth remembering how the public actually learned about all of this. Not through a royal announcement, not through a transparency initiative volunteered by the palace. It took a 5-month journalistic investigation, combing through more than 5,000 land registry documents, to surface details that had been sitting in public records the entire time, simply uncollected, unconnected, and unexamined, until 2 news organizations decided the public deserved to see the full picture in one place. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. The information was never technically secret. Land registry records are, by definition, public, but scattered across thousands of individual filings, none of it told a coherent story on its own. It took deliberate, sustained effort by outside journalists to connect lifeboat charities, to mining rights, to prison leases, to school rents, and show that they were all, ultimately, the same story. A story about how one of the wealthiest private landowners in Britain generates income, almost invisibly, from institutions the public assumes exist purely to serve the public good. It helps to put William's Duchy of Cornwall side by side with his father's Duchy of Lancaster. The Duchy of Lancaster, which funds the monarch directly, brought in roughly £27.4 million last year, slightly more than William's £23.6 million. Together, these 2 estates put more than £50 million a year into the hands of 2 men on top of the separate sovereign grant the family already receives from the British government to cover official royal duties. That grant exists specifically to fund palace upkeep, staffing, and public engagements. The duchy income is supposed to be something else entirely, a private cushion covering personal and charitable spending that sits outside the formal machinery of state funding. In practice, investigators found the line between the two has always been blurrier than the official explanation suggests, because duchy income has historically also helped cover the costs of running royal households, offices, and the public-facing work of junior family members. The Duchy of Lancaster's portfolio mirrors William's in structure, if not in geography. It holds urban developments, historic buildings, high-quality farmland, and protected areas of natural beauty across England and Wales, much of it dating back to the 14th century in the same way the Duchy of Cornwall does. And it has its own version of the NHS storage deal, the £11.4 million, 15-year agreement to warehouse Guy's and St. Thomas's electric ambulance fleet. When you set the 2 estates next to each other, what becomes obvious is that this is not a one-off oddity unique to William. It is a structural feature of how the British monarchy has financed itself for the better part of 7 centuries. 2 parallel land empires, one funding the king, one funding his heir, both drawing income from public bodies, charities, and ordinary tenants through mechanisms that remain largely invisible until someone goes looking. A £1 million hospital warehouse contract in London requires exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous document work that most newsrooms no longer have the resources to fund. That is part of why this story took 5 months and 2 major institutions working together to produce. It was never going to come from a single leaked file or a single whistleblower. It had to be assembled, piece by piece, from records that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. So where does this leave things now? The Duchy of Cornwall has pointed to its environmental pledges, its plans for carbon neutrality, its tenant support programs, as evidence that William is actively reforming the estate he inherited. Supporters of the monarchy will likely view this entire investigation as an unfair pile-on, another attempt to drag the royal family through the mud over financial arrangements that have existed, in one form or another, since the 14th century. Critics will see it as further proof that an unelected hereditary institution is allowed to operate by a different financial rulebook than literally everyone else in the country, taxing public bodies through ancient land claims while branding itself as a modern, environmentally conscious institution. What nobody can credibly argue anymore is that this is simply old news, dusty history with no modern relevance. The investigation proved the opposite. Now, these arrangements are active, current, and generating real money right now from real institutions that ordinary people depend on every single day. Lifeboats that save lives, hospitals that store ambulances, schools that educate children, a military that defends the country, all of them in ways most of their own staff and patients and students likely never realized, quietly funding the future king. The palace has stayed largely silent since the documentary aired, beyond the carefully worded statements issued by Duchy spokespeople. No personal response from William, No press conference from Clarence House, no interview addressing the specific findings about Dartmoor Prison sitting empty while rent kept flowing, or about lifeboat stations paying to reach the sea, or about a school in a small Devon town footing the bill for the privilege of existing on land the Crown claimed hundreds of years ago. Royal communications teams are generally very good at responding quickly when a story threatens to spiral, issuing statements within hours, sometimes minutes, when palace reputation is on the line. The relative quiet here speaks for itself. There was no error to correct, no false claim to knock down, because nothing in the investigation was actually disputed. The Duchy did not deny the rent payments. It did not deny the prison lease. It did not deny the energy ratings or the mining agreements. It simply explained them in the calm, procedural language companies use when they know the facts are not on their side, but the law happens to be. That gap between what is legal and what feels right to the average person paying their own taxes in full every single year without ever being offered the option to do it voluntarily is where this story actually lives. It is not really a story about £600 in lifeboat rent or even about £1.5 million for an empty prison. It is a story about an institution that has spent centuries building financial machinery so complex, so deeply embedded in ordinary public life, that most of the people funding it never even notice they are doing so. The investigation did not invent that machinery. It simply, for the first time in a long while, switched the lights on and let the public see it clearly. Whether that visibility changes anything meaningful is still an open question. Royal finance reform has been discussed in Parliament before, debated, and ultimately shelved more than once across the long history of these two estates. Public anger tends to spike for a news cycle and then fade once the next story arrives. But every time an investigation like this lands, it adds another data point to a slowly accumulating record. One that future reformers, future journalists, and future generations of taxpayers may eventually decide is impossible to keep ignoring. Whether that strategy of silence works this time, or whether this investigation marks the moment public patience with royal financial secrecy finally starts running out, is the question that remains long after the cameras stopped rolling and the documents went quiet again.